Hey, today I wanted to go over everything I read in the month of March. I read, again, close to a 50-50 split between nonfiction and fiction, a couple collections of poetry as well I got in there. So today I'm going to start with the nonfiction, followed by the poetry, and then the fiction, and I'll timestamp everything below if you wanted to skip around and look for a book in particular. The first book I'll talk about is Speaking Truth to Power by Anita Hill. This is Anita Hill's memoir, and it was really amazing. Anita Hill, if you are not familiar with the name, was the woman who came forward and accused Clarence Thomas of sexual harassment, and at the time of his confirmation hearing. So she was put on the stand for the hearing, and we heard from her the experiences that she had working under Thomas when he was part of Reagan's administration. Clarence Thomas ended up being appointed and confirmed to the Supreme Court, and he's still a justice on the court today. And this is Anita Hill's story of, first of all, beginning from her childhood, how she was raised, the family she was raised in, a huge family with over 10 siblings. Her parents were black farmers in Oklahoma, and her story of getting an education. By the time she went to school, she was going to schools that had recently been integrated, and she went on to law school and became a lawyer. And again, she worked under Clarence Thomas when he was a part of Reagan's administration. And then she went on to become a professor of law. So we start with her childhood, and then we really get to the main focus of the story, which is her experience working under Thomas. He was incredibly inappropriate in his behavior towards her, overstepping many boundaries, and really what she had to go through was totally unacceptable and terrible. And then to have to relive that again in front of the entire country, even world, were watching this as the hearing was happening, and having to relive those experiences was, of course, incredibly difficult for her. And there's a lot of focus on the media that was surrounding the hearing at the time, the way the media was treating Anita Hill, the way the Congress members were treating Anita Hill, really was just terrible. There were not many people who were respecting her or treating her in a proper way. And she is a professor of law, so her writing is very technical. She's very exact and to the point. She's very well educated, and that really shows in her writing, and the explanation of the going-ons of the hearing and the subsequent kind of fallout and aftermath of that. You know, her life was absolutely turned upside down and has been different ever since. So I thought this was really well done and totally commendable and honorable of her, and so brave of her to share her story. And I think it is very important to read and to continue to remember the experiences that Anita Hill had, and just how terrible the process was that allowed someone who is a terrible person with bad behavior and actions to become a Supreme Court justice. And again, you know, we've seen that since then. Things have not changed, and that is very disappointing and frustrating. Cockroaches by Scholastique Mukasonga, translated by Jordan Stump, is a memoir of the author's experience growing up in Rwanda, part of the Tutsi ethnic minority that were persecuted, killed, and underwent a genocide from the Hutu ethnic group in the 90s. 1994 really was the genocide that occurred in Rwanda, the Rwandan genocide, but years leading up to this, of course. This doesn't happen overnight. This was a conflict that had been ongoing and really brewing for a long time. And again, we start with Mukasonga's childhood. She grew up in Rwanda with her family and friends, and underwent a lot of harassment and mistreatment. Both her friends and her family. Their family was forcibly removed from their home, and Mukasonga ended up leaving Rwanda in the late 80s, I believe, or around somewhere in the 1980s. She left the country and wasn't able to return until after the genocide had taken place in 1994, and she returned to find nearly all of her family and friends had been killed. And this is an incredibly difficult story to read. It is graphic in its descriptions of violence and death, and your heart is absolutely broken for Mukasonga, her family, friends, and everyone who went through this terrible, terrible ordeal. It's really, really powerful to read about, and I encourage anyone who is unfamiliar with the Rwandan genocide to research it, read some of these firsthand accounts, and again, similar to what I said about the first book, this is something that we don't want to forget, and the people who have been brave and courageous to put these experiences to paper deserve all the respect, and this was an incredibly important book for me to read. A Burst of Light by Audre Lorde is an essay collection, and I apologize if you're hearing the wind around me. It is very loud and windy outside, so you're likely hearing some of that. This is an essay collection by Audre Lorde, who I love. She was a Black feminist lesbian poet. She was an activist, and her words are incredibly moving and powerful. She was incredibly intelligent and both an amazing written and oral speaker. This essay collection has a couple essays at the beginning that are quite short. I'll just list those so you kind of get an idea of the content of this collection. We have Sadomasochism, Not About Condemnation, I Am Your Sister, Black Women Organizing Across Sexualities, Apartheid USA, Turning the Beat Around, Lesbian Parenting, 1986, and A Burst of Light, Living with Cancer, which is the titular essay of this collection and is the final essay that you reach and does make up the bulk of the words in this book. And so I'll focus on that. This has to do with Audre Lorde's cancer, and which did ultimately end her life. She was diagnosed with breast cancer, had a mastectomy, and then years later to find out that cancer had metastasized, I hope I'm saying that correctly, to her liver, and that was what ultimately ended her life. In A Burst of Light, she is talking about the final few years of her life and living with cancer. She is incredibly resilient in her attitude to this experience that she is going through, that obviously is racking her body physically, her mind emotionally. Dealing with cancer is no easy thing, as we all know. Her words remain really hopeful and empowered, and it feels really lucky to read her words that she was writing even through illness, that she continued to be so vulnerable and share her experiences with us. She is a favorite author of mine, so it felt really wonderful to read these words from her. Autocracy, Inc., The Dictators Who Want to Run the World by Anne Applebaum. This is a short nonfiction discussing various autocracies throughout the world, though it primarily does discuss Russia, Venezuela, China, and Zimbabwe. And it's an explanation of how these governments and others are currently, or present day, colluding to kind of upset other global democracies and just in general what they are able to kind of do behind the scenes to really orchestrate what they want to happen politically. Overall, I thought this book was all right as an intro to the topic, but it really was lacking the breadth that I thought the topic deserved and kind of needed for a better understanding. And I feel like ultimately the second half of the book was a lot less stronger than the first. She doesn't really go into capitalism and greed as motivators as to why people would like to keep their power and wealth. And also, it did seem like she kind of viewed the US under sort of rose-colored lenses. She doesn't absolve the United States of their, guilt and implications in these this kind of global political sphere, but it was written post-Trump, and I fear and found that she was not as critical of Trump's government as she really should have been. So overall, this was all right, but I think I would have preferred perhaps a different person writing on this, or just a more in-depth account. This was, again, very short, so while it fit the bill for a short intro, I think I was just desiring a bit more. 117 Days, an account of confinement and interrogation under the South African 90-day detention law by Ruth First. This is another memoir, and this is very specific. This is of Ruth First's account of being imprisoned by the South African government. Ruth First was a key person in the anti-apartheid movement. Her and her husband, Joe Slovo, I first heard about while reading Nelson Mandela's book, Long Walk to Freedom. They were mentioned numerous times. Joe was mentioned more than Ruth, but she really stuck out to me because many of the people mentioned were men, and she was a woman who was very involved. And so naturally, I was very curious to hear more of her story, and found out that she had written about her imprisonment. And this is exactly that, the account of her 117 days being imprisoned. She was taken prisoner because of her involvement, and she was interrogated about her involvement and others, including her husband's involvement in the anti-apartheid movement. And this was very kind of dense to read. I feel like I wouldn't have gotten as much out of it if I didn't have kind of a previous understanding that I had built on by reading Nelson Mandela's book about the anti-apartheid movement. There's many names mentioned, and just kind of to get into the understanding of what Ruth is talking about, I feel like I did kind of need that base knowledge to fully grip it. So I do recommend this, not as really an entry to learning about the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa, more as an additional text to read alongside other things. And her time was very difficult. Obviously, being imprisoned, she was subjected to a lot of mistreatment, and she is also aware of her privilege in that as a white woman, she was certainly treated differently than other Black activists were at the time. She was separated from her children, who were very young, which of course would have been incredibly painful and difficult. She was not given regular visitation with them. Oftentimes she did not know really how they were, and as a mother, I would imagine that felt horrible. Her husband also, I believe for most of her time or all of it, was out of the country. He had fled because, of course, he was, they were looking to arrest him as well. So also the worry and fear of your partner, I could imagine was incredibly great for her, and she expressed that in her words here. And yeah, I thought this was very interesting. Again, great piece of additional reading to go along with some things that I've already read about prior. Fee, a memoir of my son by Alexandra Fuller. This is a memoir of Alexandra's Fuller's experience with grief after the sudden loss of her 21-year-old son, who they called Fee. And I'm not going to talk a ton about this book. I don't think it is incredibly valuable really at all to be especially critical of this kind of a subject. This is incredibly personal, really the worst loss that someone could have, the loss of their child. And obviously this is her processing that. She's incredibly vulnerable with us, and I do think there are glimpses of very beautiful writing in here. And Alexandra Fuller herself has quite an interesting life. She was raised in Zimbabwe, I believe, with her family, and she then moved to various places in Africa and now lives in the United States. Her story itself is very interesting. She doesn't have a typical life, I would say, which does really add just some intrigue into her experiences. But overall, this was very disorganized, which I feel like you could feel through the writing. It was hard to stay engaged because we were jumping around quite a lot and didn't feel very complete. And again, I do not want to be too critical of this, and I think we'll just move on from there. This was incredibly personal and vulnerable of her to share through this book. I read 2 collections of poetry in March, and I'll talk about them together. I have Frank Sonnets by Diane Seuss and the Complete Collected Poems by Maya Angelou. And poetry is kind of hard to discuss, I think I'm finding more and more, because I find so much more value in dissecting an individual poem than, let's say, a collection. It's just hard to discuss poetry in this way. And I also am finding it hard to understand why some poetry connects with me and some I find just incredibly, almost just indifferent to when I read it. One of my goals this year, which I think I'll talk about soon in a video, reflecting on the first quarter of reading and the goals that I had set out for myself, was to read more poetry. So I am glad that I got these 2 in this month. Diane Seuss's book, Frank Sonnets, is a collection of sonnets, and it did win the Pulitzer Prize, actually. So very well acclaimed, loved, and this was my first experience with her work, and I had just such a hard time connecting to these pieces. I would read them over and over, slowly, in little bits, really try to dissect them, and kind of just provoke some sort of feeling in me. But for most of them, I did not feel much, and I found it much easier to connect with her work once I started watching some author interviews of her, and just hearing her read her own sonnets was much more enjoyable, really, for me, I'll say that. So that was Diane Seuss's piece. She talks a lot about themes of poverty, drug use, familial dynamics, and those are all things that I love to read about, and I feel like can be very relatable in a lot of ways. But yeah, I just felt like this one didn't connect for me. While Maya Angelou's poems, the Complete Collected Poems of hers, which I read from, I found much more enjoyable as a reading experience. Her voice just connects more with me. Her cadence and delivery style with poems, you can just hear it off the page. She uses a lot of rhyming, and a lot of her works, just you can hear them in your mind. I do think, I was already familiar with her. I have listened to her speak, listened to interviews with her, have read some of her autobiographies, so I was definitely in a bit of a comfort zone with her poems, and they were fantastic. Very empowered, very vibrant. She uses very beautiful language. She makes you think. She tackles really hard topics relating to race and gender, and I just find her a very inspiring person. I'll then go on to the fiction I read. So I read less fiction this month. It was definitely nonfiction heavy, but I did read some really fantastic fiction this month, beginning with Her Side of the Story by Alba Cespedes. This was translated by Jill Foulston, and this is an Italian author who wrote and was published from the 1930s to the 1970s. And there's kind of been a renewed interest in Cespedes' work. More of it is being translated to English. I don't know if prior to the 2020s, if any of it was translated to English. I believe maybe one book was, but it had gone out of print and things. So all of a sudden there is a renewed interest in her work. And I'm not totally sure what spurred that, but I'm very happy that that is the case so that I can read her books. She has been mentioned multiple times over by Elena Ferrante as being an inspiration for Ferrante's work, who I love. I love Ferrante, so to hear her talk about someone else as inspiring her instantly made me want to read her work. This story follows Alexandra, who is growing up in Italy under Mussolini's rule, and she's reflecting on her life story. This is written like an autobiography of Alessandra's life. She begins with childhood. Alexandra is a young girl growing up with her parents, and tragically, her older brother, would have been, had passed away. And this kind of grief is infused throughout the novel, the loss of this sibling, and specifically the mother's dealings with that, Alessandra's mother. Throughout this book, I can totally see where Ferrante's inspiration really came from. You're very infused in the familial Italian family and the goings on, and you're also set against this really dramatic political backdrop. There are, talk of listening to the radio, talk of communists, talk of being afraid. She has friends throughout this novel who are various levels of involvement with the Communist Party, and they are punished for that. You almost forget when you're reading it that we are actually kind of set up at the beginning as this is Alexandra telling her story, reflecting on her past. You almost forget that as you're reading because you are just so in her story. It's very immersive. The writing was beautiful. It's a very sweeping story if you like kind of epic family. Though we're just focused on one person, it still had that epic quality of it. And if you like Ferrante, you'll very likely love this book as I did. Of Mice and Men by John Steinbeck. I read this month as part of my reading Steinbeck this year. This was a reread for me, though I hadn't read it since high school, so it was a long time in between my readings. And really the only recollection, I had a recollection of the plot, but really my only memory of feeling I had about the book when I read it in high school was, oh my gosh, that ending was crazy. And it was great to revisit this book. It's so short, and I don't think I need to discuss a ton about it. We are following George and Lenny. They are migrant workers in the Salinas Valley. They come to a new farm to continue their aspirations of trying to financially make it so that they can have, a little land of their own, a home, have some security, and things quickly go very wrong. And it is very gripping. I think everybody should read this book. A lot of people read it in school, but if you haven't already read it, you certainly should. The Snow Child by Eowyn Ivey. This is a historical fiction book set in 1920s Alaska, and it is infused with magical realism elements. It follows a couple who are grieving the loss of a stillborn child, and they kind of are running away from it all. They leave their close-knit community and their family in somewhere on the East Coast, I believe, and they make a very dramatic shift to living in Alaska. The climate is very different. We're also in the 20s, so homesteading looks a lot different. The community is very dispersed, and it ain't easy out there, as they come to find. And one day they make a child out of snow, and it comes to life, becoming their little daughter. This is a great transitional book to read between winter and spring. I read it right at the cusp of the change of the seasons. While it doesn't snow where I live, just the atmosphere of this snowy, hard winter time is perfect for reading this book, and the transition into spring really kind of caps off this book as well, which is beautiful. It's very tender. It's nice to watch the relationships grow, both the couple healing their own relationship with each other and how they warm up to their neighbors in their community, and then of course the relationship that they have with their snow child. It really is so beautiful, and I think that most everybody would really enjoy this book. And the only real critique of it I have is that you really see the ending coming, which isn't very surprising. You know, it follows a fable, a story that you are made aware of early in the book, and so you kind of know where this is headed. But the ending itself is just very beautiful in the way that it kind of sums up the story. Shred Sisters by Betsy, Lerner. This book was insufferable to me. I really hated it. And I did leave kind of a bit of a rant review on Goodreads on this one. I don't get it. This book, everyone was saying beautiful writing, great story, and no, I don't think it was such. We follow two sisters, Amy, whose perspective we are in for the entirety of the book, and Olivia, who is her dysfunctional older sister, who is incredibly unstable, unhealthy mentally, and continues to make bad choices. You know, you have, it's so stereotypical, the goody two-shoes daughter, and then you have the problem child. I hate that stereotype going from the get-go, if it was maybe done in an interesting way, but this just followed all the cliches in just an absolutely ridiculous way. The characters, plot, dialogue, all of it was not anything to write home about, nothing particularly special. And really what bothered me more than anything was that this book was hypocritical of itself in the way that multiple things were happening. Not only the characters and their actions and their dialogue sometimes would just not line up. We are told a character feels this way about something, and then they immediately do an action that is the opposite of what someone with that feeling would do, which doesn't make much sense. They say something that we are told that they mean, and then they immediately do an action that is the opposite of that. Even the story itself was kind of just badly written in the way that things were discussed. Some things that are coming to my memory are, we are told, oh, Olivia might be in this institution for up to 3 years, though this is an institution for people who are undergoing mental crises, and it's kind of a short to long-term stay. We are told, we are given a specific time frame. It's an institution that people are in from 6 months to 3 years, 3 years being the cap. Then immediately, a couple paragraphs later, we're told, oh my gosh, we should be worried. Olivia might be in this institution for life. Well, that directly contradicts what we were told about the institution. And then a couple paragraphs, pages later, we're then told, oh, well, thankfully she got out in 2-3 years, whatever. That itself, I think, is just a sign of bad writing. The author is the person who is deciding what the institution is and what its restrictions are. So then why is she contradicting herself then with what the characters are thinking about and being told? You know, these aren't, once the author says that it is an institution that people could stay at a maximum of 3 years, she lays that line there. So then why does she make her characters contradict that in their thinking, oh my gosh, Olivia's going to be here for life? They're all well aware of the restrictions on that. I don't know. I'm already going way too in depth on such a tiny thing, and that's kind of how I felt by the end of this book. There were way too many tiny things that just did not add up, did not make sense. And then to top it off, at the ending, Amy kind of graduates from therapy. She's healed And her therapist recognizes that in her and kind of does this symbolic thing of, oh, you don't need me anymore, which is just utterly laughable because Amy learned nothing at all. She's still incredibly naive, doesn't have healthy boundaries, and makes poor decisions, all of which she could really use therapy to help herself figure out. And which she does throughout the book. She has the therapist, and then the author proclaims by the end, oh, Amy's healed and she's good. She's good now. Utterly ridiculous. I don't know. You can read more on my Goodreads review on that one if you want to. Pigs in Heaven by Barbara Kingsolver is the sequel to The Bean Trees. And in The Bean Trees, we're introduced to Taylor and Turtle. Taylor is a young girl who is escaping her hometown, feeling very glad to have made it out of high school without teenage pregnancy. She's looking on for, bigger and better things than what home had to offer. And through just fate, coincidence, a young girl is ditched in her car. Turtle is a young Cherokee girl who was abandoned by her family and just left in Taylor's car alone, unaccompanied, and Taylor then takes her on as her child. That all occurs in The Bean Trees, and their relationship is introduced to us as, Taylor adopts Turtle. Taylor is acting as Turtle's mother. She is her mother. In Pigs in Heaven, we are continuing with that relationship. Taylor and Turtle are both a bit older, and through kind of a freak experience, they are kind of put in the public eye after Turtle saves a guy's life. Now, this brings some attention to them, and they are under scrutiny now from a Cherokee woman who is experienced in law and sees their relationship and calls it into question. Well, Turtle cannot be legally adopted by Taylor without the tribe's permission under the Indian Child Welfare Act. This is a real law. And so that relationship is called into question, and that's really where the plot of this story lies. And this is very well researched by Barbara Kingsolver. You can just tell in the way that she writes, in the way that she sets up this story, and just how well researched this is, which I think is, it's something to be praised, but also it's another thing where it's like, well, everybody should be doing their research when writing a fiction book on real world topics, Everybody should be doing their research for fiction. But it is super admirable, and also it's so easily recognizable in Barbara Kingsolver's work. She takes this research very seriously, and you can tell through her writing. And I did also kind of want to read from the beginning of this, where she has a very, very brief acknowledgement to that research that she did. But she ends that acknowledgement by saying, "Other people would tell this story differently, and none of them would be wrong," which I just really had to think about. I really loved that statement, and I think that was a beautiful thing to say. Barbara Kingsolver is really great with her characters. You care about them so instantly. They feel so real, and I already loved Taylor and Turtle from The Bean Trees, but Pigs in Heaven, you really just love them even more, especially when you're fighting for their relationship, but you are also so sympathetic, and also this is a very real issue. The Indian Child Welfare Act was put into place because historically Native and Indigenous children were taken from their families wrongfully and subjected to a lot of harm. So you have this very, very compelling story that Barbara Kingsolver sets up here. And really the only flaw in this was that it was just too long. There is a large section in the middle of this book that I feel like could have been condensed more tightly. We're set up with the stakes really high, which I think lends itself to wanting to, follow that. We want this plot is so compelling. The stakes are high. We want to be kind of on that path to finding out what the resolution is going to be the whole time. And oftentimes, I think in the middle of the book, we really kind of strayed from following that. There was a lot of characters and mentions of things that maybe weren't so relevant. And Pigs in Heaven is about 100 pages longer than the Bean Trees, and I think it would have benefited from being about the same size, just keeping it a little bit tighter. But overall, was really happy to read this and read another Kingsolver novel. And also complete this little duology she has here with Bean Trees and Pigs in Heaven. That also felt great to do. Then the final book I'll just mention here briefly, because I did do a whole standalone review on this, which I will link here as well if you wanted to watch, was Rejection by Toni Tulathimutte. This is a short story collection, and I really loved it, and I think it is incredibly engaging and lends itself well to conversation, and would love to hear what others have to say. So if you're interested in hearing more about that, do watch my standalone review of that. But that concludes what I read in March. I'm looking forward to what I'm going to read in April. And like I mentioned earlier with my poetry goals, I think I'm going to do a video on reflecting on this first quarter now that it has been completed, what the standouts were, what maybe the missteps, do I need to adjust the goals I have for myself, things like that. So I'm looking forward to sharing that soon with you. All right, have a nice day. Bye-bye.